In October 1942, over the waters of the Solomon Islands, the U.S. Navy faced one of the most precarious situations in its Pacific campaign. The Guadalcanal operation was barely weeks old. American forces were still consolidating their tenuous hold on Henderson Field, the airstrip that would become the linchpin of control in the region. Naval Command was desperate to maintain air superiority, but the environment was chaotic. Dense jungle, unpredictable weather, and the constant shadow of Japanese carriers hunting nearby. At dawn, the first signals reached the American task force. Radar operators aboard the light cruiser USS San Francisco picked up fleeting contacts, ambiguous blips over the ocean. The readings were erratic, shifting. The carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and the smaller escort carriers supporting them, were poised to launch their fighter squadrons. Every decision mattered. Every delay could allow the Japanese to strike first. Commanders at sea squinted into the low-hanging clouds, uncertain if what their instruments reported was enemy formations or false echoes. In the ready rooms of the carriers, the air group commanders were already preparing for launch. Lieutenant Commander John Smith of VF-10 checked the fuel and ordnance status of his F-4F Wildcats. Flight decks buzzed with mechanics and pilots, a precise choreography under immense pressure. Communications channels crackled intermittently. Reports were fragmentary. Orders issued in the task force flagship had not yet reached all the carriers. The clock was running. Every second lost increased the risk of catastrophic surprise. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance planes were already circling overhead. Their pilots were experienced, familiar with these waters and the limited visibility of the Solomon Islands. They could spot the American carriers from dozens of miles away and relay positions back to their strike aircraft with deadly efficiency. But on the American side, radar operators struggled with identification. There was no time to confirm. Commanders had to act on incomplete information. By mid-morning, the situation intensified. The American carriers had scrambled several squadrons into the air, but coordination was breaking down. VF-10, BF-11, and the Marine Squadron VMF-223 had been dispatched on overlapping vectors. Fuel levels were marginal. Some squadrons were airborne longer than planned, searching for contacts that remained elusive. The sky over the Solomon Sea became a patchwork of intersecting patrol routes. Pilots scanned the horizon, their eyes straining against glare, clouds, and the occasional flares of anti-aircraft fire. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise, Admiral William Halsey faced a dilemma. Reports from radar were conflicting. His carriers were vulnerable to air attack. The Japanese were known to strike fast, and any delay could allow a wave of torpedo bombers to break through defensive screens. Orders went out in rapid succession. Some were acknowledged, others delayed or misunderstood due to signal interference. Communication lines were stretched thin. The chain of command was fraying just when it needed to be most reliable. Below decks, the air crew prepared for what they had trained for but never expected to feel so immediate: the uncertainty of a battlefield with invisible enemies. Maintenance crews worked frantically to ready engines and armament. Pilots double-checked flight paths, aware that any misstep could place them miles away from support when contact occurred. Each squadron had been briefed with projected enemy positions based on outdated intelligence. They were now operating in a dynamic, unpredictable environment. The Japanese were methodical. Their reconnaissance provided a fragmented but actionable picture. Small formations of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros appeared sporadically over the horizon, probing American defenses. These planes were fast, agile, and relentless. They forced American fighters to respond immediately, often diverting them from their primary search patterns. Every interception required careful judgment. A miscalculated maneuver could leave a squadron exposed, or worse, stranded without fuel over open water. As the sun climbed higher, tension on the carriers mounted. Signals from distant squadrons indicated scattered contacts. Some were false. Some could have been Japanese patrols. Confusion reigned. Flight leaders attempted to consolidate their formations, but wind shifts, cloud cover, and limited visual range made cohesion difficult. Pilots called in positions and headings, but the numbers didn't add up. Squadrons were splitting and merging, sometimes losing track of one another entirely. The command center aboard USS Saratoga tried to piece together the rapidly shifting picture. Radar operators reported multiple contacts approaching from several vectors. Signals intelligence suggested Japanese torpedo bombers were en route, but confirmation was incomplete. With each minute, the risk to the carriers increased. Orders were sent to reassign intercepting squadrons, but pilots already in the air had only partial knowledge of who was where. A single miscommunication could allow an enemy attack to strike with devastating effect. In the air, American fighters found themselves chasing phantom contacts. Pilots strained to identify friend from foe. The Japanese exploited every gap in radar coverage and formation coordination. A handful of Zeros appeared, vanishing almost as quickly as they were spotted. Each encounter forced quick maneuvers, tactical adjustments, and sometimes abrupt returns to carriers for refueling. The operational tempo was unforgiving. Below, the carriers themselves became nerve centers of calculation. Fuel estimates, ammunition status, and aircraft readiness all had to be balanced against a rapidly evolving threat. Admiral Halsey and his staff worked tirelessly, issuing orders to reorient squadrons, adjusting launch sequences, and attempting to anticipate Japanese movements. Every decision carried weight. Every second of delay could compound into disaster. By late morning, the confusion reached a critical point. American command had effectively lost track of the positions of several squadrons. Reports from pilots were delayed, partial, or conflicting. Some had drifted off assigned sectors. Others were circling low over the ocean, uncertain of where the main task force was located. The radar screens indicated movement, but the dots were unidentifiable. The American fleet was operating blind in crucial respects, with a ticking clock forcing them to act. In the midst of this chaos, the first reports of enemy torpedo bombers reached the task force. Their numbers were uncertain. Timing was unpredictable. Squadrons still aloft faced a dilemma of intercepting or conserving fuel. Flight leaders attempted to reorganize their forces, but the disarray was now systemic. The carrier's ability to coordinate defense relied on piecemeal communication, overburdened operators, and pilots scattered across miles of ocean. The situation escalated further as intercept vectors overlapped. Air groups maneuvered to avoid collisions, but the cloud cover and sudden shifts in altitude made coordination nearly impossible. Reports indicated at least 3 squadrons were now completely unaccounted for. Commanders tried to reconcile the data, but the radar and visual reports conflicted. Every decision was a gamble. Every moment spent uncertain risked a strike on the carriers before the squadrons could be recalled or repositioned. By noon, the task force faced an unprecedented moment of vulnerability. The American carriers, central to the operation, were surrounded by uncertainty. Squadrons intended to shield them were dispersed, some low on fuel, others misaligned with the original intercept patterns. Radar blips suggested incoming threats, but the identity, number, and direction of approach remained uncertain. The Japanese were methodically closing in, and American command had no clear picture of the air defense network they had deployed minutes earlier. Across the bridges, in the ready rooms, and on flight decks, the tension was palpable. Every officer understood the stakes. Loss of Henderson Field to an aerial attack could unravel the entire campaign. Yet, with squadrons unaccounted for and communications fragmented, American command faced a paradox: act decisively and risk deploying incomplete forces, or delay and risk exposure to the enemy. As the first torpedo bombers were sighted far beyond the radar horizon, several American squadrons were still airborne, scattered and operating without centralized guidance. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. Engines strained in the hot morning air. Pilots attempted to regroup based on fragmented instructions, but the cohesion needed to mount an effective intercept was failing. The clock ticked on, and every second brought the fleet closer to confrontation without the full strength of its airborne defenders. By early afternoon, the unfolding moment reached a crucial juncture. Commanders realized that several squadrons, dispatched to patrol sectors over the ocean, had effectively vanished from the tactical map. Some were misdirected by storm fronts. Others had engaged minor reconnaissance aircraft, delaying their return. Fuel reserves were becoming critical, and carriers were signaling for their return. But the distances involved were vast. The Japanese threat loomed ever closer. The scene over the Solomon Islands was now a tense standoff. American carriers were operational but exposed. Their fighters were airborne but scattered and partially unaccounted for. Japanese reconnaissance had identified gaps. Incoming torpedo bombers would soon exploit those gaps. The time for decision-making had narrowed to minutes. Every operator, pilot, and commander understood that the next moments would define whether the fleet could hold or be severely damaged. And then, almost simultaneously, radar picked up multiple incoming contacts, fast-moving, low on the horizon, converging on the carriers. American command had seconds to assemble squadrons for interception, but several key squadrons were still lost in the air, their positions unknown. The task force faced a dangerous gamble: commit the available forces and hope they could cover the carriers, or hold back and risk an unchallenged strike. In the air, pilots searched desperately for formation mates. Some were low on fuel, some diverted by false contacts. Communication lines were thin. Intercept vectors were being assigned and reassigned in real time. The Japanese planes were closing fast. The moment had arrived when command had lost track of its squadrons entirely. The carriers, the linchpins of the American strategy, were exposed. And in that instant, the clock did not pause. Every second was a countdown to confrontation. The American fleet waited, vulnerable, tense, and uncertain, while the Japanese threat approached. The threat had materialized. By mid-afternoon in October 1942, the skies above the Solomon Islands were tense with imminent danger. The Japanese torpedo bombers were closing fast, their formation slicing the horizon. The American carriers, critical to the campaign at Guadalcanal, remained exposed. Command had lost track of multiple squadrons. Fuel gauges were perilously low. Every second of delay amplified the risk of a catastrophic strike. Radar blips shifted erratically across the screens of the USS San Francisco and USS Saratoga. Operators strained to identify friend from foe, each blip a potential enemy aircraft. But visibility was inconsistent. The clouds scattered, and the sun's glare reflected off the ocean, masking the true positions of incoming planes. Commanders could only make decisions based on incomplete, often contradictory reports. Every order was issued with a mental asterisk. This may be wrong. Adapt if needed. In the air, pilots pushed their Wildcats and F-4Fs to the limit. Some had been airborne for over an hour, searching assigned sectors, scanning for contacts that never materialized. They were now low on fuel, engines straining under the tropical heat. Yet the Japanese approached with terrifying efficiency. The familiar silhouettes of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes appeared over the horizon. The formation tight, coordinated, and relentlessly advancing toward the carriers. American squadrons scrambled to intercept, but cohesion was failing. Squadrons had split across vast distances, some inadvertently chasing phantom targets. Pilots signaled positions, attempted to form up, but cloud cover and wind made coordination almost impossible. Intercepting the first wave meant reorganizing mid-flight, making instantaneous tactical decisions, and hoping each pilot understood the revised plan. Below, the task force was a nerve center of frantic calculation. Admiral Halsey and his staff coordinated via flag signals, radio transmissions, and signal lamps, but the volume of conflicting reports strained every channel. They attempted to predict the Japanese approach based on speed and bearing, but the reconnaissance planes had been elusive. Some pilots had reported sightings only for those planes to vanish, leaving empty skies and uncertainty. The first American intercepts engaged lightly with the forward elements of the enemy. These were brief, sharp skirmishes, dive bombers dodging, torpedo planes veering, exposing the challenge of defending a fleet under fragmented command. Fuel and ammunition were finite. Every dogfight, even minor, carried the risk of leaving a squadron stranded without support. Some pilots were forced to turn back for refueling, while others pressed forward, attempting to hold the Japanese at a distance. Confusion compounded with exhaustion. Pilots were making decisions second by second. Flight leaders attempted to maintain formation integrity, but many aircraft were operating independently due to disrupted coordination. Some groups failed to meet at assigned waypoints. Others were circling in search patterns for squadrons they could not locate. Communication lines strained under repeated transmissions, sometimes interfering with other commands. The carriers themselves were trying to track forces scattered across tens of miles of ocean. By late afternoon, the first torpedo bombers reached striking distance. Radar operators confirmed multiple low-level contacts converging on the task force. The American squadrons still airborne attempted rapid interception. Pilots dove toward the incoming planes, forcing evasive maneuvers and scattered formations. It was a delicate dance. Engage too early and risk splitting forces. Engage too late and the carriers might be vulnerable. Each pilot's judgment was critical, yet the chain of command could not fully track every move.
The Japanese exploited these gaps. Torpedo bombers approached from multiple angles. Dive bombers were overhead, their target vectors forcing American fighters to divide attention. Some squadrons managed brief engagement, forcing attackers to adjust approach, while others were forced to withdraw due to fuel constraints or confusion. Every maneuver required coordination that had been nearly impossible to maintain given the disarray. In the task force command centers, signals and radar reports were crossed, squadrons were misreported, positions unknown. Admiral Halsey faced the constant stream of fragmented intelligence, VF-10 engaging enemies south of the fleet, followed by VF-11 lost contact with formation, and VMF-223 returning to Enterprise for fuel. Each message carried incomplete information, forcing decisions based on probabilities rather than certainty. American pilots fought on, knowing that the fleet's survival depended on intercepting the Japanese before they could launch torpedoes. Wildcat pilots dove, turned, and engaged, but gaps persisted. Some pilots were forced to abandon assigned intercept sectors to avoid collisions or low-fuel emergencies. Formation leaders tried to keep groups intact, but the tactical landscape was fluid, constantly shifting under pressure. On the deck of USS Saratoga, deck crews prepared for rapid landings of aircraft returning from engagement. Fuel lines were active, mechanics on standby, ready to refuel and rearm planes in a record time. The rotation of squadrons became a delicate balancing act. Returning aircraft needed servicing immediately, while launches continued to maintain a defensive perimeter. One misstep, one delayed refuel could leave a critical gap in the air cover over the carriers. As the afternoon progressed, the first major engagement began to unfold. Japanese torpedo bombers had reached the distance where attack runs were possible. American squadrons intercepted partially, but some enemy aircraft slipped through, forced to maneuver against the defensive fire of the task force. Pilots were operating at the limits of endurance, responding to multiple threats simultaneously. Every maneuver required split-second calculation and precise execution, even as fatigue set in. Confusion escalated. Several American squadrons had effectively lost one another. Reports came in from multiple aircraft claiming contacts that could not be confirmed. Intercept vectors were reassigned mid-flight, causing some groups to diverge or double back unnecessarily. Communication delays meant that some pilots were unaware that their intended target had already been engaged by another squadron. The disorientation over the open ocean compounded the stress and risk. Fuel became a critical factor. Pilots diverted from engagement to return to carriers, only to find that decks were congested with other returning aircraft. Landing queues slowed operations, forcing some to circle longer than anticipated. The Japanese maintained pressure, adapting to the disrupted American air cover. Each wave of attackers exploited gaps, forcing American squadrons to chase, intercept, or disengage under increasingly adverse conditions. By early evening, the situation reached its zenith.
American command was aware that several squadrons remained unaccounted for. Some were running dangerously low on fuel, others displaced from assigned sectors. The carriers were under constant threat. Japanese aircraft were maneuvering to exploit weak points. Communication channels were overwhelmed. Decision-making occurred in compressed windows, often with incomplete or conflicting intelligence. Command attempted to coordinate remaining squadrons for a consolidated defense. Pilots in the air responded as best they could, forming impromptu groups where possible. But the environment was punishing. Clouds drifted in and out, obscuring vision. Aircraft identification became more challenging. Distance from carriers increased the risk of running out of fuel before a safe return. The task force was straining every resource to maintain its defensive posture. The first American squadrons returned to carriers, landing in quick succession, refueling and rearming for a potential second wave. But with so many aircraft still missing or delayed, the fleet remained vulnerable. Radar contacts indicated additional Japanese planes approaching from unexpected vectors. The horizon was alive with activity, enemy formations adjusting, American fighters attempting to regroup, and command centers calculating probabilities rather than certainties. Exhaustion was now evident. Pilots had flown hours over open water, constantly scanning for contacts, coordinating with scattered wingmen, and engaging the enemy under chaotic conditions. Ground crews worked at breakneck speed to turn returning aircraft. Communication lines were saturated, with messages repeating, conflicting, or being lost entirely. The air picture was dynamic, confusing, and dangerous. By nightfall, American command faced a sobering realization. Multiple squadrons were still missing, the Japanese threat had not fully engaged, and the task force remained partially exposed. The carriers had survived initial attacks, but only barely. The environment of uncertainty persisted. Every decision still carried enormous weight. Every second was a countdown to the next critical engagement. And then, as dusk settled over the Solomon Sea, radar picked up a new, fast-moving formation, larger than before, converging from a different angle. American command knew that the next wave would be decisive. Squadrons were low on fuel, scattered, or yet to reach interception positions. The fleet teetered on the edge, vulnerable, exhausted, and uncoordinated. The Japanese strike was imminent, and the American carrier's full air cover was not yet consolidated. Commanders and pilots alike understood the stakes. If they could not organize in time, the fleet would face its most dangerous moment yet. The fleet is exposed, squadrons are scattered and low on fuel, and the major incoming Japanese strike is closing in from an unexpected vector. The situation is unresolved. Night was falling over the Solomon Sea in October 1942. The horizon darkened and the American carriers remained vulnerable. Squadrons were scattered, low on fuel, and in some cases completely out of position. Radar still indicated multiple incoming Japanese aircraft, faster, more coordinated, and ready to exploit the gaps that the disarray of American air cover had created. Commanders on the bridge of the USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga worked with grim determination, issuing orders that could either prevent disaster or come too late. The first Japanese aircraft approached under the fading light. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers maintained tight formations. Some pilots dropped lower to evade American radar. Others adjusted their approach to avoid known patrol sectors. The American squadrons, still airborne, though scattered, responded as best they could. Wildcats engaged aggressively, attempting to intercept incoming torpedo planes while protecting the carrier's flanks. The situation remained chaotic, but gradually, pockets of organization began to form in the air. On the deck crews had been working non-stop, refueling and rearming returning aircraft with incredible efficiency. Pilots landing after exhausting patrols had seconds to shut down, refuel, reload bombs and ammunition, and launch again. Coordination between flight deck crews, air control officers, and radar operators was pushed to its absolute limits. Each successful launch or landing reinforced the fragile defensive perimeter around the carriers. By early evening, some squadrons had re-established partial formation integrity. VF-10 and VMF-223, previously separated, began to link up, providing much-needed intercept capability. Fuel constraints still limited operational time, but American pilots were now positioned to challenge the incoming torpedo formations. Every engagement required split-second decisions: which enemy aircraft to prioritize, which approach vector to take, and how to maintain coverage over the carriers. The first Japanese attack reached its peak. Torpedo planes dove toward the carriers, while dive bombers prepared to release ordnance. American fighters engaged as interceptors, forcing several enemy aircraft to alter courses or abort attack runs. The combination of radar warning, disciplined anti-aircraft fire from the ships, and fighter interception prevented a direct hit on the carriers in this initial wave. The task force, while still under immense pressure, held its defensive line. Japanese forces adapted quickly. They launched successive waves from multiple directions, attempting to exploit the scattered American coverage. Each engagement was fast, intense, and required immediate tactical judgment. Pilots maneuvered aggressively, coordinated as best as possible, and leveraged the limited formation cohesion they had rebuilt. The American fleet's survival relied on this rapid response and the extraordinary endurance of its air crews. Some American squadrons ran critically low on fuel mid-engagement. Flight leaders had to disengage from combat to return to carriers. Flight leaders recalculated intercept patterns, reassigning positions to fill gaps. The carriers executed rapid deck rotations, launching fresh aircraft even as others landed, creating a constant cycle of airborne defense. This relentless tempo strained every pilot and mechanic, but it maintained the fragile integrity of the fleet's protective screen. Gradually, the combination of fighter interception and concentrated anti-aircraft fire began to disrupt the Japanese attacks. Dive bombers were forced off target, torpedo runs were aborted or missed due to defensive maneuvers, and the American squadrons, despite being initially scattered, managed to consolidate enough to provide effective coverage. The tide of the battle began to shift. American command, though exhausted, was finally able to track most squadrons and assign intercept sectors more reliably. By late evening, the majority of the Japanese attack had been repelled or forced to disengage. The American carriers had suffered minimal damage, thanks largely to the heroic endurance of their pilots and crews and the disciplined, if chaotic, coordination of remaining squadrons. Radar operators and signal officers worked continuously, maintaining the delicate network that allowed squadrons to engage effectively despite earlier confusion. The final moments of the battle revealed the cost of disarray. Several American aircraft were lost due to fuel exhaustion, navigational error, or being outmaneuvered by Japanese planes. A few pilots were forced to ditch or bail out over open water. Despite these losses, the carriers themselves remained operational, and Henderson Field on Guadalcanal remained in American hands, a strategic linchpin secured. The chaos of the earlier hours had been resolved through rapid adaptation, disciplined response, and the ability of scattered squadrons to reorganize under extreme pressure. The fleet survived, not without strain, but with its primary mission intact. The Japanese, unable to break through the air defenses and frustrated by missed torpedo runs, eventually withdrew under the cover of night. Commanders assessed the outcome with relief and renewed vigilance. They understood that the battle had highlighted critical weaknesses in communication, coordination, and air control. Lessons from this engagement would shape subsequent operations across the Pacific. The fleet's endurance in the face of scattered squadrons and relentless enemy pressure demonstrated both the risks of losing track of forces and the importance of disciplined improvisation under combat conditions. By the time darkness fully settled over the Solomon Sea, the American carriers were operational. Most squadrons accounted for, and the immediate threat had passed. Fuel reserves were replenished where possible, aircraft were repaired and refueled, and pilots were debriefed. The engagement had lasted hours, but its consequences were long-lasting. The night left a stark reminder. Even a few lost squadrons, even for minutes, could imperil an entire task force. Yet, through rapid adaptation, training, and coordination under pressure, American forces had held. The Guadalcanal operation continued. The carriers remained central to air support, and Henderson Field stayed in Allied hands, a testament to endurance, skill, and disciplined response amidst chaos. In the end, the fleet survived a storm of confusion and aggression. Command had regained control of its squadrons, the clock had kept running, and history had recorded a hard-fought, high-stakes engagement that underscored the fragility and resilience of naval air power in the Pacific War. The engagement concludes with American forces holding Guadalcanal and the carriers intact, squadrons accounted for, and the Japanese strike repelled. The story ends naturally.